Hi everybody. Hopefully you've started thinking about your action research project. Maybe you have some little inklings going on. The purpose of this tutorial is to help guide you in designing your question for your action research project. Now keep in mind this is your project. It needs to be something that's interesting to you that relates to reading instruction. So the field is wide open. But be sure it's something that's interesting because you don't want to spend the better part of the semester studying something that's not really of interest to you. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. I'm going to talk you through the process of deciding what your question is and even a little bit about setting up the wording for your question. It's tough to really move forward in your project until you have that question designed. My hope is that by the time you meet with your writing team for the first time, you have at least something that you have to work with when you go to that writing team, because they can't really give you feedback unless you have some ideas to take with you. So it isn't necessarily that you have your question exactly written by the time we get done with this video, but you're on your way. Okay, first I want you to think about what within your educational practice are you concerned about? As you look across your classroom, you look at your students and their and the process of learning to read, what is going on that makes you wonder, or makes you curious, or makes you worried? And why is this important to you? Maybe it's something that relates to your school's expectations or your school district expectations, or maybe it's something that you notice about your students and you want to try to figure out a way to make things better. And then, and this is a key, is there anything I need to better understand about this within my educational setting before I do something about it? So this project may not be a project where you actually try something out. It might be a project where you're just exploring and learning more. It all depends on what it is you want to know. Sometimes we decide that we want to try out a strategy, and then as we dig further, we find out, wait a minute, I don't really know enough to be able to do that well, and so your question might change as you get started in your project, and that's perfectly fine. So to get started, after you have thought about what's important to you, then see how that relates to a broad topic related to reading. I've listed some here, but you're not limited by this list. This is just a starting point. So there may be things that are more specific that are interesting to you than what I've included here. But see if you can pick out, if I said to you, what is your action research project about? You could say, my project is about reading comprehension. So it's just really an overview topic that is guiding you at this point. But once you have identified what's important to you and kind of an overview topic, then we're going to start focusing more in on the questions themselves. So I want you to start with just doing some brainstorming. This is a question development strategy from a book called Make One Small Change, teaching students to ask questions. And it's a good one to use with adults too. So brainstorming, typing or writing down as many questions as you can about the topic that you've identified. Don't stop to think about them, talk about them with anyone else, and definitely don't stop to try to answer those questions. Write down every question as you think of it. As you're thinking, if you come up with a statement, see if you can change that to a question. So this is a time when you're just getting those ideas out. The goal here is to let the ideas flow freely. Try not to pigeonhole yourself into a certain question right off the bat, because you may pick a question that's way too difficult for the scope of this project, or you may pick a question that's not necessarily appropriate. So brainstorming gives you a lot of options to work from. After you finish that brainstorming, I'm going to have you look across those questions and see if there's a trend. So let's say your general topic is reading comprehension. You brainstormed a bunch of questions, and maybe you have several questions that somehow relate to, let's say, oral reading versus silent reading. Questions might vary a little bit, but they all center around that kind of general idea. That could help pinpoint your focus. What we're going to be doing is identifying questions that are what is questions, what is silent reading, what is oral reading comprehension, and what works questions like what would happen if I paired up students to read orally together in my 5th grade classroom. Okay, that's a what works question. So we're going to try to identify one or the other of those types of questions for your project. What is questions are more if you want to just know some general information about a topic. Maybe it's something that you want to learn more about, so then you can go and tweak that in your teaching. But for our purposes, we would be at that first step of what is something. What works questions really rely on you trying out a strategy or a model, trying it out with your students and seeing how it works with them. Keep in mind, we are not, in our action research study, we are not trying to prove that something works better than something else. Okay, that's a different kind of study. Our action research study is really looking at what works well with this group of students, or what is something, and understanding that then helps you make better decisions about implementing different strategies. We'll get to this a little bit more. So your question or questions, if you have two questions together, they must be narrowly focused. So this is a small project, and we're going to try to keep it small, and we do that by having a narrowly focused question. If your question is too broad, it's going to be a project that really is beyond the scope of this class. Your question has to be one that's researchable given your limitations. So it has to be a question that you can answer in this project, but it has to be a question that you can answer in this project. So I'm going to try to help you keep that question narrow and focused, so you're not trying to do something that's bigger than a 2-credit class. You know, this is not a huge research study that you're going to take to a research conference and present to the research community. This is a study that looks at something that's going on in your teaching and how can you improve it. So let's keep the focus on that. That's why I said it's not a project where you're going to decide which works better. That's beyond the scope of what we're going to do. It also has to be a question that you can answer with data. And I should have put on there data that you have access to, right? So you're not going to have to go outside your classroom to get data. And we want the data collection to be within the realm of what you would already possibly be doing with your students. So it's not that you have to give them another assessment or have them do something beyond the kinds of things you would be doing in your classroom. So that's how we kind of keep everything narrow, focused, doable. That's our word here, doable. So here's a sample. A teacher might say, my students don't seem to enjoy reading. Okay, so that's kind of that first part. What is important to me? What do I notice? What am I curious about? They don't enjoy reading. What can I do? So a broad topic then is going to have something related probably to reading motivation or reading interest. So I have 2 sample questions. How do my students feel about reading? So maybe I think they don't seem to enjoy reading, but maybe they enjoy it more than I think that they do. This is a what is question. Remember, that's a question where you're just trying to understand something. You're not trying to fix it yet. Hopefully you will once you understand it better. That would be part 2. That would be beyond the scope of this project. But another question, and so let me back up. So how do my students feel about reading? A what is question. So if I were to collect data about that question, I could have my students fill out an interest inventory that relates to reading. You can find those online. You could do some other kind of a survey. You could have them record in a journal after silent reading time in the classroom. You could ask their parents. You could send a survey home and ask their parents. You could have them interview each other. You could interview some students. But so your data collection really is about trying to understand this idea of how students feel about reading. You're not going to prove anything, but you're going to develop a better understanding. So you'll get that data, you'll look at it, analyze it, and you'll try to reach a conclusion about how your students feel about reading. You're doing this in a systematic way. Of course, you could watch them, you could have incidental conversations with them, but action research is about systematically looking at something. And so that's why you would use some sort of data collection. Now, an alternative question could be, how can I help my students develop a love of reading? So let's say you already have a pretty solid idea that your students don't like reading. Maybe you've talked to them, maybe you already interviewed them or given them a questionnaire or something else. Now you want to know, okay, I can see for sure that they don't like to read. How can I help them develop a love of reading? This is more of a what works question. What can I do that will help change this? Now, it's a great question, but it's not that good for an action research project because develop a love of reading is kind of vague. You know, who really is going to define what love of reading actually means? So a better question, a narrower question, a more refined question, still along the same line would be, in what ways does participating in a reading club increase students' reading comprehension and reading motivation? So now I have two things here. I have my strategy, that's participating in a reading club, and I have my outcome, increase reading comprehension and reading motivation. So now I'm trying something out, the reading club, and I'm trying to see how well it works. That's a what works kind of question. Remember, you're picking one or the other for your project. So back to this question, in what ways does participating in a reading club, you remember the question, and I want to point out this idea of strategy. So a what works question always has a strategy, so keep that in mind. What is it you're going to try out? Or it could be a method, or it could be materials that you want to use with your students. What is it you're going to try out? And it has an outcome. What are you trying to do? What do you hope is going to happen once you try that out? Keep that in mind when you're writing that what works kind of question. Now, remember our three things. Narrowly focused. Okay, in this question, what ways does participating in a reading club, etc., is that narrowly focused? Actually, I would change that question just a little bit. If you were bringing that question to me, I would suggest that you either focus on increasing reading comprehension or increasing reading motivation, because those are two different things. They are related, they can impact each other, but for the scope of our project, remember, researchable given the limitations, so we're trying to keep our project doable, I would eliminate one of those. Whichever one you felt the strongest about, you could keep, but I would encourage you to eliminate one of those. Narrow things down. And then, of course, being able to answer this with data. So if you were trying to decide if a reading club increases reading comprehension, you could look at assessment data that's already going on in your classroom. If you're giving any kind of informal reading inventory that has comprehension questions to it, end of a unit assessment, it's not really going to do you any good to use the state assessment, right? Because it's only given once a year. And so you wouldn't have any maybe pre-post data that you could compare to. So you could have students do a written retelling before and after you do the reading club implementation. So the question definitely lends itself to a pre and post test. So is their reading comprehension like before you do reading club, and what is it after? Same for reading motivation. You could do surveys, interest inventories, interviews, and I would do a before and after to see if there was a change. And that would help you know if you wanted to keep doing reading club after this class is over. So, tips. Again, keep that narrow focus. I'm going to help you do that. So if you have the question in mind and you want to send it to me in an email, go right ahead and I'll kind of talk you through it and help you think about if that focus is narrow enough. Maybe the focus is narrow, but maybe you need some rewording or reframing of the question, and I can help you with that too. So can your writing team. If you're asking a yes/no question, expect that you would have to include more than one question. For instance, do my students enjoy reading? Yes, no. And then the second part of that question could be, how do I know? Or why or why not? So it is possible that's a time when you would have more than one question. Remember, if you're choosing that what works question, to include your strategy or your method or your intervention or your materials, whatever it is you're going to try out, and then your outcome. What do you expect to happen? And then be open to revising your question. What might happen is that you spend some time and you get a question just the way you like it, and then you start in on the next step, which is reading the literature review. The literature out there is to write your review. So you're going to be reading at least 5 research studies that relate to your question. And when you're doing that, you may decide, this question isn't quite right. Instead of this strategy, I want to try out this other strategy, or however you want. And it's certainly fine to change that question. Now, you don't want to change it too much when you get too far in the project, because then you basically have to start over. So that's why we're going to put some time in at the beginning, tweak those questions, get them to be really good so that you don't have to make too many changes or too big of changes as you go along. So hopefully this video has helped you think about your question and get you kind of muddling through those steps and getting to the point where you can actually work out a question. Remember, the goal is for you to have something, at least maybe a couple things to take with you to your first writing team meeting. Good luck, and we'll be in touch.